Sometimes the most dangerous moment in history is not when enemies raise their weapons, but when two people from opposite worlds begin to trust each other. The forest surrounding the core zone was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural, the kind of silence that made even the wind seem careful as it moved through the tall pines. Moonlight spilled across the clearing like silver water, illuminating the ancient stones that marked the edge of the territory no human had been allowed to study for more than 30 years. Clara Bennett stood beside one of the monitoring devices she had set up earlier that afternoon, her tablet glowing softly in her hands as streams of data scrolled across the screen. The numbers made sense to her in a way the world rarely did. Energy fluctuations, temperature shifts, magnetic disturbances, patterns hidden beneath layers of mystery. But tonight the data was strangely calm. Too calm. Almost as if the forest itself was watching her work. She adjusted a sensor mounted 3 feet above the ground, brushing a strand of brown hair behind her ear while glancing toward the dark tree line. Even after weeks here, she still couldn't quite get used to the feeling that the woods were alive with awareness. Somewhere behind her, a twig snapped softly. Clara didn't turn right away. She already knew who it was. Adrian Blackwood had a presence that was impossible to mistake, even when he tried to stay quiet. The Alpha King stepped out from the shadows of the trees with the effortless stillness of someone who had spent his entire life moving through the wilderness. Tall, composed, his dark coat catching the moonlight as he approached the clearing. He stopped about 10 feet away, keeping the careful distance they had both silently agreed upon since the beginning of their uneasy alliance. For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was something else now, something steady. Clara finally glanced up from the tablet. "You're watching again," she said calmly. Adrian's silver-gray eyes reflected the pale light of the moon as he studied the instruments surrounding the core zone. "Protecting," he corrected quietly. His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to command, yet there was something softer beneath it tonight. Clara exhaled a small breath of amusement. "You say that like the forest is dangerous." Adrian's gaze shifted toward the distant hills beyond the trees. "The forest is honest," he replied. "It's people who are dangerous." Clara considered that for a moment while the sensors hummed faintly around them. The core zone pulsed slowly beneath the earth, invisible but powerful, like a heartbeat buried beneath centuries of silence. "The readings are stable tonight," she said, turning the tablet so he could see the graph lines. Adrian stepped a little closer, though still careful not to cross into her space. For a brief moment their shoulders were only inches apart, close enough for Clara to notice the faint scent of pine and cold air that seemed to follow him everywhere. Close enough for Adrian to hear the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was a small moment. Quiet. Harmless. Yet somewhere beyond the clearing, hidden deep within the shadows of the forest, another pair of eyes watched them together and slowly disappeared into the darkness, carrying with it the first whisper of a plan that would soon turn trust into the most dangerous weakness of all. The quiet of the clearing did not last long after the sensors finished calibrating, because silence in the core zone never truly meant peace. Clara Bennett lowered the tablet slowly as another soft pulse moved through the ground beneath her boots, so faint that a normal person might have missed it entirely. But the instruments surrounding the clearing recorded every fluctuation with quiet precision. The circular monitor positioned 2 yards away flickered as fresh readings appeared across the screen, thin lines rising and falling like a slow breath beneath the earth. Clara studied the numbers carefully, her brow tightening with concentration. The energy signature was stable, almost too stable, the kind of balance that felt temporary rather than natural. She knelt beside the central sensor and adjusted the antenna by a few inches, watching the data stream update again. Behind her, Adrian Blackwood remained exactly where he had been standing, 10 feet away at the edge of the clearing, his posture relaxed but alert. To someone unfamiliar with the way wolves moved, he might have appeared completely still, yet his senses were moving constantly through the forest around them, listening to the wind brushing through the tall pine branches, tracking the small movements of animals deeper in the woods, and feeling the subtle rhythm of the ancient power hidden below the soil. His gaze eventually returned to Clara as she worked. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The quiet had become something comfortable now, something that no longer felt like a fragile truce, but something closer to trust. Clara finally exhaled softly, and rose to her feet. "That is strange," she said, tilting the tablet toward the moonlight to see the display more clearly. Adrian stepped forward another few feet, careful, as always, not to crowd her space. "Strange how?" he asked calmly. Clara tapped the screen and turned it toward him so he could see the graph. "The energy field should be shifting more than this. According to the geological models, the core zone behaves like a living system. It rises, it falls, it changes with pressure and temperature. Tonight it is almost perfectly balanced." Adrian studied the lines for a moment, even though the scientific data meant little to him compared to the instinctive awareness he carried in his blood. "Balance is not always natural," he said quietly. Clara looked up at him. "You think something is affecting it?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward the forest ridge to the north where the moonlight barely touched the tree line. "The forest feels watchful tonight," he said. Clara followed his gaze, but saw nothing except endless rows of dark trunks and branches. "You say that like the forest has opinions," she replied with a faint smile. Adrian's expression softened slightly. "It does not have opinions," he said, "but it remembers." The words lingered between them as the wind shifted gently through the clearing, carrying the cool scent of pine and distant mountain air. Clara hugged her arms lightly against the chill. "You really believe this place remembers everything that has happened here?" Adrian looked down at the ground where the core zone slept beneath layers of earth and stone. "I do not believe it," he answered. "I know it." Clara studied him for a moment, trying to understand the quiet certainty in his voice. Adrian rarely spoke about the deeper connection between his kind and the land, but every time he did, there was something almost reverent in his tone. "My father used to talk about this place like that," Clara said softly. Adrian turned his attention back to her. "Your father studied the core zone before anyone else." Clara nodded slowly. "He always said it was not just energy. He said it was something older, something that reacts to people the way people react to storms." Adrian watched her carefully. "And do you believe him?" Clara hesitated for a second before answering. "I did not at first. I thought it was just scientific curiosity. But after spending the last 3 weeks here," she glanced down at the glowing instruments around them, "I am starting to think he was not entirely wrong." Adrian took another step closer without realizing it. The distance between them had narrowed to only a few feet now, close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of his presence in the cool night air. For a brief moment the two of them stood side by side, looking out over the silent clearing as if the forest itself were listening. Neither of them noticed the faint movement far beyond the trees where a hidden observer paused long enough to confirm what he had suspected all along. The Alpha King was no longer simply guarding the human scientist. He was standing beside her. And in the quiet language of wolves, that difference meant everything. The wind shifted slowly through the tall pine trees surrounding the clearing as the quiet conversation between Clara Bennett and Adrian Blackwood faded into a thoughtful silence. The sensors placed around the core zone continued their soft electronic humming while the hidden energy beneath the earth pulsed with a rhythm that felt ancient and patient. Clara stared at the data on her tablet again, trying to understand the strange balance she had been measuring all evening. It was not the kind of stillness scientists expected from a natural system. It felt deliberate, as if the forest itself had decided to hold its breath. Adrian stood beside her, close enough now that the distance between Alpha King and human scientist no longer felt like a barrier. Yet neither of them realized that far beyond the clearing another set of eyes was studying them with careful attention. From the shadow of a ridge nearly 40 yards away, a tall figure remained hidden behind the thick trunk of an old cedar tree. Darius Wolf had been watching the clearing for almost 20 minutes without moving. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp and calculating as they followed every small movement between the Alpha King and the woman standing beside him. Darius had served the Blackwood pack for most of his life, and he understood the language of wolves better than most. The way Adrian stood slightly angled toward Clara, the way his attention never drifted too far from her presence, the way the quiet space between them had become natural rather than cautious. To an outsider those details might appear meaningless, but to someone raised inside pack hierarchy, they spoke with perfect clarity. Something had changed. Darius lowered his gaze briefly, considering the meaning behind what he had just witnessed. The Alpha King was supposed to guard the border between their world and the world of humans. He was supposed to enforce the treaty that had kept peace for 3 decades. Yet tonight Adrian Blackwood had not been standing like a ruler protecting territory. He had been standing beside a human scientist, as if the line between their worlds had quietly disappeared. Darius exhaled slowly and stepped back from the ridge, disappearing deeper into the trees without making a sound. The forest swallowed his movement instantly, the same way it had hidden wolves for centuries. As he walked through the dark path between the pines, his thoughts moved quickly. The pack had already been uneasy about Adrian's decisions. Many wolves respected their alpha king, but others questioned the strange balance he tried to maintain between tradition and change. Adrian carried human blood through his mother, and although he had proven his strength many times, whispers about that mixed lineage had never completely disappeared. Tonight Darius had seen something that could turn those whispers into something far more dangerous. A human scientist standing at the heart of their sacred territory, and the Alpha King standing beside her not as a guard, but as a partner. Darius stopped when he reached the edge of a narrow dirt road that cut through the forest nearly a quarter-mile from the clearing. The moonlight illuminated the empty path, while distant mountains formed a dark horizon beyond the trees. He took a slow breath, considering the possibilities that now unfolded before him. Knowledge was power in any world, human or wolf, and what he had just learned could become a weapon if it reached the right ears. Back in the clearing, Clara adjusted another sensor, while Adrian watched the forest with quiet awareness. Neither of them sensed the shift that had already begun moving through the shadows beyond their sight. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment does not begin with conflict or anger. Sometimes it begins when someone notices that trust has quietly grown where suspicion once lived. The moon had climbed higher above the forest canopy when the quiet work around the core zone slowly began to settle into a steady rhythm. Clara Bennett knelt beside the final sensor unit position near the outer ring of the clearing, tightening the small calibration bolt with careful precision while the screen on her tablet displayed the latest readings. The soft glow of the display illuminated her face as she studied the numbers once more, making sure every instrument was synchronized with the central monitor. Around her the forest remained calm, but the deeper she studied the data, the more a strange feeling grew in the back of her mind. Something about the stability of the core zone felt too perfect, like a machine running at an exact balance instead of a natural system responding to pressure and temperature. Clara finally stood up and stretched slightly, her eyes drifting across the clearing where the small cluster of monitoring devices hummed quietly beneath the moonlight. Adrian Blackwood stood only a few feet away now, his attention shifting between the instruments and the forest that surrounded them on every side. His posture remained relaxed, yet there was a quiet alertness in the way he held himself, as if every sound moving through the night air passed through his awareness before it reached anyone else. Clara walked toward the central monitor and glanced at the display again. "All sensors are stable," she said thoughtfully. Adrian stepped closer, his silver-gray eyes moving across the glowing screen, even though the language of scientific data was not his specialty. "Stable can be good," he said calmly. Clara shook her head slightly. "Not always. Natural systems move. They change constantly. This place feels like it is waiting for something." Adrian looked out across the clearing where the ground beneath the grass held the hidden energy that both of them were trying to understand in their own ways. "The core zone has always been patient," he replied quietly. Clara studied his expression for a moment before speaking again. "You talk about it like it is alive." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched beside one of the older stones positioned at the edge of the clearing, resting his hand lightly against its weathered surface. "The land remembers everything that happens to it," he said. "Every step, every voice, every moment. Wolves learn to listen to those memories." Clara watched him thoughtfully. Her father had once described the core zone with almost the same words. At the time she had dismissed those ideas as poetic exaggeration, something a scientist should question instead of believe. Yet standing here now, surrounded by a forest that seemed older than recorded history, she was no longer certain that her father had been wrong. "My father used to say that places like this respond to people," Clara said quietly. Adrian lifted his gaze toward her. "And what do you think now?" Clara hesitated before answering. "I think he may have understood something the rest of us missed." For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt heavier now, filled with thoughts neither of them had expected when their uneasy alliance first began. Adrian slowly stood again, his attention drifting back toward the dark trees beyond the clearing. The wind carried the faint scent of distant rain across the mountains nearly 10 miles away, along with something else that stirred quietly at the edge of his senses. It was not a threat, not yet, but it was a reminder that the balance between their two worlds had never been simple. Clara noticed the subtle shift in his posture. "What is it?" she asked. Adrian shook his head slightly. "Nothing certain." He looked back toward the instruments glowing softly behind her. "But the forest is changing tonight." Clara followed his gaze across the silent clearing. The monitors continued their calm, steady hum, the numbers scrolling slowly across the tablet screen as the core zone pulsed beneath the ground like a hidden heartbeat. What neither of them realized was that far beyond the trees the quiet plan forming in another mind had already begun moving forward, carried through the shadows by someone who understood exactly how powerful trust could become when it appeared in the wrong place. The forest remained still after Adrian spoke those quiet words about change, yet the air around the clearing seemed to carry a subtle tension that neither Clara Bennett nor Adrian Blackwood could fully explain. The instruments surrounding the core zone continued to glow softly beneath the moonlight, while the energy buried beneath. The ground pulsed in slow, steady waves. Clara walked toward the central monitor again and studied the data scrolling across the screen, her mind carefully comparing each line of information with the readings she had recorded earlier that afternoon. Something about the pattern felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing a single piece that refused to reveal itself. She tapped the screen gently and adjusted the sensitivity, setting on one of the sensors positioned nearly 3 feet above the ground. A new series of readings appeared across the display, the lines shifting slightly before settling again into that same unnatural balance. Clara frowned thoughtfully. "It is doing it again," she said quietly. Adrian stepped closer, his attention immediately moving toward the tablet in her hands. "Doing what?" he asked. Clara turned the screen so he could see the data. The energy field should be reacting to environmental changes. Temperature, pressure, even the movement of wildlife. But the core zone is holding the same pattern over and over. Adrian studied the glowing display for a moment before lifting his gaze toward the dark forest surrounding the clearing. The quiet of the night carried distant sounds that only his heightened senses could fully separate from the background of wind and leaves. Somewhere nearly half a mile away, a small herd of deer moved cautiously along a hillside. Farther west, an owl glided between the trees. Everything sounded natural, yet the deeper instinct within him continued to whisper that the balance of the forest had shifted in ways that could not be measured by machines. "Perhaps it is not reacting because it is already responding," Adrian said slowly. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Responding to what?" Adrian looked down at the earth beneath their feet. "To us." Clara gave a small thoughtful laugh at that idea, though it was not dismissive. "You really believe that the land notices when people stand on it?" Adrian's expression remained calm. The wolves who ruled this territory long before humans built cities believe that everything in the forest listens. The ground, the trees, even the rivers. Clara rested her hands lightly on the edge of the monitoring case and stared out across the clearing where moonlight spilled across the grass like pale silver. Her father had spoken about this place with the same quiet respect Adrian carried in his voice. Back then she had believed science would eventually explain every mystery the world offered. Now she was no longer certain that every answer would come from numbers and measurements alone. "If the core zone really responds to people," she said slowly, "then it must have been reacting long before I arrived here." Adrian watched her carefully. "You believe your father awakened something when he studied this place?" Clara nodded once. "Maybe not awakened. Maybe he simply noticed it." The wind moved gently through the clearing again, brushing across the tops of the sensors and stirring the tall grass near the outer stones that marked the boundary of the sacred territory. Adrian turned his gaze toward the distant tree line, sensing once more that quiet feeling of movement beyond their sight. It was not a threat, but it was a reminder that the balance they stood inside was fragile. Clara followed his gaze again. "You still feel it, do not you?" she asked. Adrian nodded slightly. "Something in the forest is watching." Clara glanced around the clearing, but the darkness beyond the instruments remained empty and calm. Neither of them realized that miles away a quiet chain of conversations had already begun spreading through the hidden corners of two different worlds, carried by those who had discovered that the Alpha King and the human scientist were no longer standing on opposite sides of the same line. The quiet tension hanging over the clearing did not fade as the night deepened, and the longer Clara Bennett watched the data streaming across her tablet, the more she felt the strange certainty that the core zone was not simply resting beneath the earth, but listening in a way no instrument could measure. The sensors around them continued their steady humming, while the hidden energy below the soil pulsed with patient rhythm, almost like a distant heartbeat moving through stone and roots. Clara walked slowly along the circle of monitoring devices, stopping at each one to check the signal strength and confirm the readings were still synchronized with the central monitor. Every number remained steady. Every pattern repeated the same calm balance she had noticed earlier. Behind her, Adrian Blackwood moved quietly along the edge of the clearing, his attention drifting between the instruments and the surrounding forest where the dark line of trees stood like silent guardians beneath the moonlight. His instincts had not relaxed since the subtle change he had sensed. Earlier, the forest sounded normal, yet something beneath that normal rhythm continued to shift just beyond certainty. Clara finished adjusting the final sensor and stepped back toward the center of the clearing where the main monitor glowed softly. The system has been stable for nearly 40 minutes, she said thoughtfully, studying the newest readings appearing across the display. Adrian approached slowly until he stood beside her again, close enough that he could see the faint reflection of the screen lighting her face. "Is that unusual?" he asked. Clara nodded once. "Extremely unusual. The core zone behaves more like a living ecosystem than a mechanical source. Even minor changes in wind pressure or ground temperature should create fluctuations in the field." She paused as she studied the graph once more. "But tonight everything is balanced almost perfectly." Adrian looked down at the ground beneath their feet, as if he could sense the quiet movement of the ancient power resting there. "Perhaps it is calm because it knows something is coming," he said quietly. Clara glanced toward him with mild curiosity. "You say that like the core zone understands the future." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the mountains nearly 10 miles away where thin clouds were beginning to drift across the sky. Wolves learn early that the land speaks in patterns. When those patterns become too quiet, it often means something larger is approaching. Clara considered his words carefully. The scientist in her wanted to dismiss the idea as instinct shaped by tradition rather than evidence. Yet standing here in the middle of a forest older than most recorded history, surrounded by instruments that confirmed something unusual was happening beneath the surface, she found herself listening to Adrian's intuition with growing respect. "My father used to say something similar," she admitted softly. Adrian looked at her again. "About the core zone?" Clara nodded slowly. "He believed the energy here reacts to people the way a lake reacts to stones dropped into the water. Every action creates ripples." Adrian studied the quiet clearing as the wind moved gently through the grass around them. "If that is true," he said, "then someone may already be creating ripples we cannot see yet." Clara rested the tablet against the monitoring case and folded her arms lightly as she stared across the clearing. The sensors continued their calm, steady hum while the hidden power beneath the earth maintained its quiet balance. What neither of them realized was that far from the core zone, inside a dimly lit operations trailer parked along a gravel road nearly 6 miles away, a man named Marcus Hale leaned over a glowing computer display, studying satellite data that matched Clara Bennett's research logs almost perfectly. Marcus tapped a single key on the keyboard and smiled faintly as the simulation updated on the screen. "Interesting," he murmured to himself while the model displayed the energy patterns beneath the forest. "Very interesting. Because sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are not made by scientists standing in the field, but by the people who learn how to use those discoveries for their own plans." The night deepened around the core zone as the quiet pulse beneath the earth continued its patient rhythm, and for a long moment the clearing seemed suspended between two worlds that did not yet realize how closely their futures had begun to intertwine. Clara Bennett leaned over the central monitor again, her eyes following the steady patterns on the screen while the faint glow from the display illuminated the surrounding instruments. Every reading remained balanced. every fluctuation settling back into the same calm curve she had been watching for nearly an hour. It should have been reassuring, yet the longer she studied the data, the more she felt the strange sense that the stability was not natural but deliberate, as if something beneath the ground had chosen to remain silent. A cool breeze moved across the clearing and stirred the tall grass around the outer stones that marked the ancient boundary of the territory. Adrian Blackwood stood near the edge of the instruments, his gaze drifting slowly across the forest that surrounded them. The instincts that guided him as Alpha King rarely failed him, and tonight those instincts remained restless in ways he could not easily explain. The woods were quiet, but not empty. Somewhere beyond the trees a chain of decisions had already begun unfolding. Clara finally looked up from the monitor and studied Adrian for a moment. "You have been watching the forest for 10 minutes without moving," she said gently. Adrian turned his attention back toward her. "The forest is watching us as well," he replied calmly. Clara folded her arms lightly while considering that answer. "You keep saying that tonight." Adrian stepped a little closer to the instruments, the moonlight reflecting faintly in his silver-gray eyes. "Because it is true tonight more than usual." Clara glanced around the clearing again, her gaze moving from the quiet sensors to the dark line of trees nearly 30 yards away. Everything appeared peaceful, yet the strange balance she had been measuring in the core zone continued to echo Adrian's unease. "If someone were watching us," she said thoughtfully, "your senses would know." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the earth beneath their feet, where the ancient energy of the core zone rested deep below the soil. Sometimes the most careful observers do not reveal themselves until they have already learned what they came to see, he said quietly. Clara absorbed those words with a small, thoughtful nod. She had spent most of her life inside laboratories where observation meant gathering data and forming theories. Out here, observation meant something very different. Silence could hide intentions far more complex than any scientific model. Nearly 6 miles away, inside the operations trailer park beside a narrow gravel road, Marcus Hale leaned back from the computer terminal that displayed the latest satellite readings from the forest. The glow of multiple screens filled the small trailer, while digital maps of the core zone pulsed across the monitors in bright layers of color. Marcus studied the simulation carefully as a faint smile formed on his face. The energy pattern beneath the clearing was behaving exactly as he expected. Calm on the surface, predictable, easy to follow. He reached for a small radio unit resting on the desk and spoke quietly into the microphone. "Confirm the signal relay is ready." A voice responded from the other end after a short pause. "Relay confirmed." Marcus nodded to himself as he watched the digital map update again. "Good," he said calmly. "Because once the signal activates, the scientist will notice the change immediately." Back in the clearing, Clara's tablet suddenly vibrated softly in her hand as a new data alert appeared across the screen. Her eyes widened slightly as the graph lines shifted for the first time all night. The perfect balance she had been studying began to move. The soft vibration of Clara Bennett's tablet seemed unusually loud in the quiet clearing as the alert signal pulsed against her palm, and for the first time that night, the steady balance of the core zone shifted into motion. Clara stared at the screen while the smooth line of data that had remained stable for nearly an hour suddenly dipped and rose in a sharp curve that had not appeared in any of her earlier readings. Her eyes widened slightly as she tapped the display to enlarge the graph. The numbers updated again, and the change became impossible to ignore. "That is new," she said quietly. Adrian Blackwood moved closer at once, his attention sharpening as he studied the glowing tablet in her hands. "What changed?" he asked. Clara swiped across the screen and pulled up the secondary sensor data. "The field strength just jumped nearly 5% in less than 10 seconds, she explained carefully. "That should not happen without a significant trigger." Adrian glanced toward the forest as if the cause might already be moving somewhere beyond the trees. "A trigger from the land?" he asked. Clara shook her head slowly. "Possibly, but the pattern looks almost artificial." She tapped the screen again and displayed the energy map projected across the clearing. A faint ripple of new readings was spreading outward from a point nearly half a mile east of their current position. Clara pointed toward the small glowing mark on the display. "There," she said. "The fluctuation is originating from that direction." Adrian followed her gesture toward the dark tree line in the distance. The forest in that direction sloped downward into a narrow valley filled with dense cedar and oak trees. In daylight the path was easy to navigate, but at night the shadows between the trees turned the landscape into a maze of dark shapes and quiet movement. "How far away?" he asked. Clara checked the coordinates appearing on the screen. "Roughly half a mile," she replied. "Maybe a little more." Adrian considered the distance quickly. A wolf could cover that ground in minutes, but Clara would need time to move through the forest safely. He looked back at the tablet again as the data continued updating. "Is the energy rising?" Clara nodded. "Slowly but steadily. If the pattern continues, it could destabilize the entire field." Adrian studied her expression carefully. "And that would mean?" Clara exhaled slowly as she calculated the possibilities in her mind. "It could mean the core zone is reacting to something entering its boundary," she said. "Or it could mean someone has activated a secondary energy source that is interfering with the natural field." Adrian's gaze darkened slightly at that possibility. "Someone," he repeated quietly. Clara lifted her eyes from the tablet and looked toward the distant valley again. "If this is artificial, it means someone is experimenting inside the protected territory." Adrian turned his attention toward the same direction. The night wind carried the scent of damp earth and distant pine across the clearing, along with the faintest trace of unfamiliar metal that did not belong in the forest. His instincts sharpened immediately. "We should investigate," he said calmly. Clara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. If the energy continues rising, it could damage the entire research network. She adjusted the strap of her field bag across her shoulder and secured the tablet inside its protective case. The instruments around the clearing continued humming quietly as the new data streamed across the central monitor. Adrian stepped toward the tree line, pausing briefly to glance back at the equipment Clara had set up earlier that evening. "Will the sensors continue recording if we leave?" he asked. Clara nodded once. "They will transmit everything back to the monitor." Adrian gave a short nod and turned toward the dark path leading east through the forest. Clara followed a step behind him as the two of them moved away from the clearing and into the trees. Neither of them realized that nearly 6 miles away Marcus Hale leaned forward inside the operations trailer, watching the same energy spike appear across his simulation screen as a satisfied smile slowly formed on his face. "Perfect," he murmured quietly while the signal continued spreading through the model. Because the most effective traps are the ones that make their targets walk toward them willingly. The forest swallowed the last trace of the clearing as Clara Bennett followed Adrian Blackwood along the narrow trail that led east through the dense valley. And with every step, the quiet hum of her research equipment faded behind them until only the natural sounds of the night remained. The path beneath their feet twisted through tall cedar trees and thick underbrush, illuminated only by pale moonlight filtering through the branches nearly 50 feet overhead. Clara kept her tablet in one hand, watching the fluctuating graph that continued to rise and fall across the screen. The signal source remained ahead of them, pulsing slowly on the map like a distant beacon buried inside the forest. "The spike is still growing," she said quietly as she walked. Adrian moved ahead of her with the calm confidence of someone who knew every hill and hidden stream within miles of the core zone. Even in the darkness, he moved effortlessly through the terrain, stepping over fallen branches and navigating the narrow path without hesitation. "How far now?" he asked. Clara checked the coordinates again. "About 4/10 of a mile," she replied. "The signal is stabilizing, but the pattern is definitely artificial." Adrian slowed slightly and glanced back at her. "Artificial means human." Clara nodded once. "Or human technology." The wind shifted gently through the valley, carrying the faint scent of metal and machinery that did not belong in untouched forest. Adrian noticed it immediately. His expression hardened slightly as he continued forward, the instinctive awareness of an alpha sharpening with every step. "There is something ahead," he said quietly. Clara lifted her eyes from the tablet and studied the dark slope descending into the valley. The trees thinned slightly about 100 yards ahead where the ground opened into a narrow clearing between two rock formations. The glowing mark on her screen was centered exactly in that direction. "The source is almost directly in front of us," she said. Adrian stopped just before the path curved into the open area and raised his hand slightly, signaling her to pause. Clara halted beside him and followed his gaze toward the small clearing below. At first the space looked empty, but then she noticed the faint outline of a metal device positioned near the center of the grass. It was no larger than a suitcase and connected to a thin antenna extending about 3 feet into the air. A soft blue light blinked steadily from the side of the machine. Clara's eyes widened with recognition. "That is a signal relay," she whispered. Adrian studied the object carefully without stepping closer. "It does not belong here," he said. Clara nodded slowly. "Someone placed it here intentionally to broadcast energy pulses into the core zone." She glanced down at the tablet again as the data continued updating. "The relay is amplifying the natural field and sending it back into the ground." Adrian looked from the device to the forest surrounding the clearing. Why would someone do that? Clara considered the pattern appearing on her screen. "To provoke a response," she said quietly. Adrian remained silent for a moment as the night air carried the faint hum of the machine across the clearing. The trap itself was subtle, almost elegant in its design. It did not damage the land or cause chaos. It simply created a signal strong enough to draw attention from anyone studying the core zone. Clara took a cautious step forward. "If I can shut it down, the field should return to normal," she said. Adrian watched the dark tree line surrounding the clearing. His instincts still whispered that something about this situation was not as simple as it appeared. "Be careful," he said quietly. Clara nodded and moved toward the device while studying the small panel along its side. She knelt beside the relay and reached toward the control interface. The blinking blue light reflected softly against her tablet screen. Nearly 6 miles away, Marcus Hale leaned forward in his chair as a new notification appeared across the simulation display inside the operations trailer. The tracking signal he had hidden inside the relay had just activated. A small icon blinked on the map marking Clara Bennett's exact location in the valley. Marcus smiled slowly as he watched the indicator begin transmitting live coordinates. "And there you are," he murmured quietly while the tracking signal locked into place. Because sometimes the first step in a carefully designed trap is simply letting the target believe they have discovered the answer.